today, the School of Public Affairs, and also the Kogod School of Business. We want to get right to business because this is definitely a timely conversation. I want to introduce our panel, first starting with our moderator, Terry Samuel, who's a journalist from the highest levels at USA Today, NPR, and so many other institutions. And then also currently the board chair of the National Press Foundation. And Terry, what we're most proud of is you're a former Sign Fellow, and we are so proud to have you back with us today. Joining us on the panel is our very own David Marchik, who's Dean of the Kogod School of Business, who spent 12 years managing director of the Carlyle Group, but most importantly, definitely the author of Peaceful Transition of Power. As Rich mentioned before, he's literally written the book on what we're going to talk about today. So we're so happy to have him here. And somebody who's new to the Sign Institute, but we hope not for long, Rich Bagger, who's a partner and executive director of Christie 55 Solutions. He was chief of staff for Governor Chris Christie, and he was one of the people that managed the transition and on the team in the Trump 2016 transition, so has firsthand knowledge. I want to thank you, gentlemen, all for joining us today. Terry, I'm going to hand it over to you to start the program.
Thank you, Amy, and you are correct. I am also most proud of my time at the Sign Institute as a fellow. It was terrific, and it is always great to be back. I wanted to start with there's lots to get to, obviously, in this moment, because we are in the middle of one of the most remarkable transitions ever. And we will get to the specifics of this particular one, what resembles what has come before and where it does not. But I wanted to ask both David and Rich to talk a little bit about the significance of the moment, apart from the specifics of this thing. A transition in the Republic. I mean, your book is about the peaceful transfer of power. And that seems to be a significant moment in the life of the Republic. And I wondered, first, what made you want to spend so much time thinking about this? And where we go from here. And Rich, having done one of the most recent ones, kind of your sense of what this means for the country. David, you want to go first?
You want to go first, Rich?
No, David, please.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Terrence. And let me give a shout out to Rich Bagger for participating, also his leadership in the state of New Jersey, which I think is the second largest source of AU students. So we like New Jersey. And he also did a great job on the 2016 transition, which we can talk about some of the ups and downs of that. A presidential transition is a unique moment for the United States because of the way that our government is designed. No other government is structured the way that we are structured. If you were a business student at Kogod and you wrote a paper that suggested that the best way to manage a presidential transition would be to have 4,000 political appointees leave on January 20th and a new president to appoint 4,000 political appointees to run the government, you probably would get a failing grade because it's a dumb idea. It's very hard to manage. And so I'll go back to 1993 when I had hair and I worked for the Clinton campaign. And on January 20th, I was lucky enough to be one of the first people in the White House. And I walked into the White House and it was empty. The desks were empty. There were no computers. There were no files. There was not a memo that said, here's what you do from my predecessor. It was just an empty building. And it was both an inspiring but also a scary moment because literally the leadership of our country leaves and a new leadership comes in, and that creates vulnerabilities for our country, which are important for continuity. Second is that a new president has a mammoth task, appointing 4,000 political positions, including 300 to 400 at the White House, 1,250 or so positions which need to be confirmed by the Senate, which is a long process. Meanwhile, the president is managing a huge budget, $4 million personnel, including 2 million in our armed services. And international or national security incidents don't wait for a president to be ready. The clock moves forward globally, whether a president is ready or not. And that's why a presidential transition is so important. And let me turn it over to my friend Rich.
Well, thank you. And it is a great privilege to be able to participate on this panel alongside David Marchik, who, as he led the Center for Presidential Transition at the Partnership for Public Service during the 2020 election cycle, which is the NGO that fosters the best practices on presidential transitions and is the repository of the greatest expertise relating to presidential transitions, because for the most part, this is something people do once, right? Our current president-elect is doing it for the second time non-consecutively, but often people do who work on transitions do them once, and having a go-to set of resources, a go-to set of people who have developed and continue to enhance the process for most effective transitions is extraordinarily valuable. And David led that effort, and coming out of that effort, wrote the book on the peaceful transfer of power. And that is, at its very core, what presidential transitions are about. As Americans, I think among our proudest moments where power is transferred, sometimes due to a different political party, sometimes for a set of priorities that are dramatically different than the administration who precedes it. And the leaders of the country stand together at the United States Capitol and peacefully hand off power. But there's a lot more to transitions than that. And that is the extraordinary amount of work that needs to be done to ensure a seamless transfer of power, for which the stakes are very high. I think you might be able to look at the year 2000 election cycle as somewhat of an inflection point here, because with that, the length of time that it took to resolve that election, and therefore the shortened period that was available for a transition, really, I think, put a spotlight on how much work needs to be done and how important it is, especially in light of that 9/11 occurred, just 8 months, into the George W. Bush administration. So it's a lot of work. The stakes are high, and I would also just point out that with so much media attention happening on like presidential appointments to the cabinet, that reflects simply the tip of the iceberg of the work that takes place during the 75 days, the work that I trust is underway now, across a variety of dimensions of work that I'm sure we'll discuss. But it's an enormous undertaking and one well worth discussing.
Rich, can I stay with you for a moment? You've both added a lot of context here, but David talked about kind of the weight of the moment, and day to day, particularly when we're like looking for who's the nominee for this and who's the nominee for that. In 2016, did you feel the weight of that, kind of the historical weight of that moment as you were doing this?
Well, a moment that definitely when I felt the weight of the historic moment was the morning after the election. There's this procedure in transitions called ascertainment, which since the 2020 election has been changed by statute, but it's a process by which the administrator, the General Services Administration, makes a finding who the apparent winner of the presidential election is and notifies their transition the next, as soon as the sort of ascertainment is made, that the resources of the federal government are available to support the president-elect for the transition. And I took that call on the morning after the election in 2016. I was driving into, I'd been up most of the night, went home to change my clothes and was driving back to Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, and my phone rang, and it was the administrator of the GSA, who I could tell was speaking on a speakerphone. It probably had a group of people around the table, officially communicating to me the ascertainment, that they had determined that Donald J. Trump had won the presidency, and that the next phase of the transition would begin.
Remarkable. I mean, that's how we do it. No
Yeah.
armies trading, just a phone call from the GSA.
From a political appointee of the other party.
Yeah.
To say we're ready to turn over the keys.
Could we talk a little bit about how transition teams, particularly with a new administration, works with the old one, especially when there is a change in party, as we have now?
Sure, I can start and then Rich can pick up. So there are really four streams of work that a transition team focuses on. First is personnel, getting lists and vetting and preparing to recommend to the president-elect a group of people that could serve in his or her government. Second is policy. The campaign really creates policy, but the transition team prepares to implement it. Third is agency transition work, which is you get people who have worked in certain agencies ready to go talk to the outgoing officials, so there's continuity between the outgoing and the incoming. And then the fourth is something called president-elect support, which is basically work to create kind of the calendar and messaging and the sequencing of what the president-elect is going to do during the transition. The work between the outgoing and incoming is really important. And I'll give you kind of the best example and maybe a worst example of why that's so important. The best example probably was the 2008 election, where we had a transition between George W. Bush and Barack Obama. As Rich mentioned, George W. Bush had a rocky transition because of the litigation in Florida, where the outcome of the election was decided by one vote of the Supreme Court over 530 or so votes in Florida, which determined who had 270 electoral votes. So that was determined on December 13th of 2000. So Bush had a very shortened transition, and that impeded his ability to get people in place, including the national security establishment, and 9/11 occurred 8 months later. So when he was leaving office, he went to his chief of staff, Josh Bolten, and said, I don't want the next guy to have what happened to me. And he said, so I want you to work with both the Democratic nominee and the Republican nominee as if either they're going to win. I obviously have my preference, but I want you to do this on a fair basis because I want the next president to be ready. And Josh did that, and he did a really terrific job. So he was in touch with both the McCain and the Obama campaign. Well, in the fall of that year, the financial crisis occurred. Lehman, failed. Other banks, Bear Stearns failed, and the country was rushed into recession, and the auto industry was about to fail. And outgoing Bush and incoming Obama, as well as their Treasury secretaries, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Tim Geithner, who was the incoming Treasury Secretary, collaborated to really have as much of a seamless transition as possible because there was a crisis during the interregnum. And I would say, if you look at history, the same occurred in the Hoover to Roosevelt transition, where there was no cooperation, and that lack of cooperation deepened the recession, Great Depression, and impeded recovery. Here, I think George W. Bush and Obama get great credit because we came out of that recession faster than we would have otherwise. On the flip side, during the outgoing Trump administration, the incoming Biden administration, Biden clearly won. He was declared the winner. Trump never recognized the outcome of the election. And during the transition, we were at the peak of COVID. The biggest policy issue during the transition for Biden was not a policy issue. It was getting shots in arms. It was the logistics of getting the vaccine out to the American people. We had more people die daily during that transition period than any other period of the COVID crisis. I think 172,000 Americans died during the transition period. And because Trump did not recognize the outcome of the election, that impeded Biden's ability to collaborate with the officials at Department of Defense, Department of HHS, and the Budget Office to figure out a distribution plan that could benefit the American people. The Biden team did it on their own. They made up lost time, but that would have been an example where cooperation between the outgoing and the incoming would have been better.
Rich?
But following up on David's comments, I think there is a very positive tradition that has generally been followed and is to be encouraged, a president sort of wanting to pay it forward or learn from experiences. So just as George W. Bush wanted to have a outstanding transitioning out to President-elect Obama at the end of President Obama's term in 2016, it was very evident that the standard had been set that they wanted to do even better. The engagement that Dennis McDonough, the chief of staff at the White House, had with both transitions, the process by which the executive branch approached it on an even-handed basis. Sure, they were working hard and hoping earnestly that Secretary Clinton was elected president, but during the transition work, we're treating both sides in a very even-handed way. And it's important to remember when we think about transitions, everyone tends to focus on the work of the incoming administration, but there's a whole parallel and intersecting set of work streams for the administration that is transitioning out. That involves a White House Transition Coordinating Council, a cross-agency group of departmental transition directors who prepare briefings and prepare their agencies to welcome teams coming in from the president-elect's team, to ensure that there's continuity with career government officials for when political appointees leave agencies, upon the inauguration of the new president. So that's a fulsome and complex work stream that takes place within the administration that then joins up at various points with the work of the president-elect's transition team.
If I can dwell a little bit before we get to the current, dwell a little bit on some history. David, you mentioned the Bush to Obama transition, and the Clinton, the Bush 1 to Clinton is legendary for the note that the outgoing president wrote to President Clinton. And I don't remember the specifics of the Clinton to Bush because that was 2000. But is that a tradition that goes back much further than what I just described?
So I would say that George H.W. Bush set a high bar, created that tradition. He was an institutionalist, a very good person. Whether you liked his policies or not, he was a great American and cared about the country, and he was gracious even though he lost. We've had some terrible transitions in history. Roosevelt and Hoover hated each other, and they were in the car together going up to the Capitol for the inauguration, and Hoover wouldn't talk to Roosevelt. Roosevelt tried to make a little chit chat, and Hoover wouldn't talk, so Roosevelt just turned. It was an open car, convertible, and he just smiled and pretended like he was happy. There have only been 4 presidents who have not met with or attended the inauguration of their successors. Let me see if I can remember them. The 2 Adams, Trump, and then there was one I'm blanking on, but I'm not sure why the Adams were grumpy towards their success. Obviously, Adams and Thomas Jefferson hated each other. But there is a positive tradition in the United States where the outgoing collaborates with the incoming. Truman and Eisenhower didn't like each other either. Truman, of course, was notified about the existence of the nuclear bomb after he took office. And he had the same attitude as George W. Bush. He said, I don't want the next person to deal with what I had. So he reached out to the two candidates, Kefauver, or maybe it was Adlai Stevenson and Eisenhower, and said, I want to do a briefing and have you briefed before the election. And Eisenhower refused. And Roosevelt penned a great letter to him, which said, you're a fool and you're going to screw up the country. And so they didn't really get along. Carter was very gracious to Reagan. Really that tradition continues. And I think that, even though Trump did not extend that graciousness to Biden, he left, he didn't host Biden at the White House, he didn't attend the inauguration. And I think that even though Biden has said that, Trump is a risk to our country and all kinds of bad things, Biden is continuing that tradition.
So let's talk about this current transition, and let's start here with the idea that this feels very traditional. Last Wednesday, the president-elect went to the White House. He met with the sitting president. They said it was great, and this seems very traditional given the relationship that these two men have had the last time around. Does this feel different to you, Rich?
Well, I think there are two things about this year's transition that are unprecedented in modern American presidential history. And I hesitate to use the word unprecedented because people used it so much, over the course of the last election cycle. But we do have a president-elect who previously served as president, right? Which hasn't happened in 140 years or whatever. So we're with the presidential transition. That is, really the first time in modern history that has occurred. So we have a president-elect who has been there before and who has people with him who have been there before. And that is a different dynamic. The other thing that is, at least in comparison to some recent transitions, is that it is unclear, I think continuing as of this date, as to whether the president-elect's transition will, sort of follow the sort of pathways set forth in the Presidential Transition Act of, relating to the memorandum of understanding with the executive branch and how things are, have sort of typically been done stepwise. And so that would be, at least in the context of the last few transitions, sort of unprecedented not to follow those pathways. However, it does seem sort of quote normal in the sense of it was nice in the meeting at the White House last week, and that the appointments, whatever one thinks of them, are coming out, and the commentary about them and the process that'll lead up to Senate confirmation hearings seems to be well underway.
Rich, is there anything that you've seen thus far? You mentioned the Presidential Transition Act that is concerning to you in terms of how we end up in terms of governance down the road.
Yeah, well, they're really and I'm sure David will want to expand upon this, but they're really sort of three sets of decisions that a presidential transition needs to make, sort of relative to how they're going to work with the executive branch, with the outgoing administration, most of which are voluntary, but in recent transitions have been followed. Right. The first is whether or not to accept resources from the General Services Administration and accept the appropriation that's provided to the president-elect in office space and IT and telecommunications, et cetera, which is then required if there's an election to accept those resources. It requires a memorandum of understanding between the transition and the executive branch that has certain requirements attached to it, such as disclosure of contributors to the transition, limitation upon contributions to the transition, sort of public, submission of a conflict of interest policy, et cetera. There's a second decision that relates to whether or not to send landing teams into executive branch agencies. These are teams of people from the transition who, typically would have experience in those agencies to come in and receive briefings, ask questions, prepared to brief the secretaries, nominees, and to be sort of ready to hit the ground running in those departments. Well, to send in those teams requires a memorandum of understanding between the transition and the White House that sort of governs the terms of how those interactions are going to take place, and requires the disclosure of who the individuals are who are engaging with the current administration. And then the third step relates to security clearances. And a process that should begin before the election, to ensure that the people who are working on the transition and on landing teams have the appropriate security clearances to be able to receive classified briefings and information, once they go into departments. And so it's not entirely clear to me, in the current transition, whether those things are happening, whether they're going to happen in the framework of the Presidential Transition Act, or whether they're going to happen, somehow outside that framework.
David, you've described what you've seen so far as.
Yeah, so I'd say there are a few things that are troubling, and I like the history. I'm kind of a history geek, and Trump twice has had very good people working for him in the incoming and outgoing transitions, only to throw that work away and screw it up. Okay, so on the incoming in 2016, Rich and Governor Chris Christie, with whom Rich worked, did a really fantastic job preparing for a transition. And famously, Trump, 3 days after the election, decided to replace Chris Christie, and all that work was gone. On the outgoing, there's a fellow named Chris Liddell, who is Deputy Chief of Staff, who did a really good job preparing for either a Trump second term or a Biden victory. And at the time of the election, Trump kind of, impeded the process. Here, I think that, he had people that were competent people, Linda McMahon and Howard Lutnick, leading the transition. They did traditional transition. And what I've seen is that Trump is just kind of making things up as he goes along without vetting. He's appointed 14 cabinet level officials in 2 weeks. Okay, that's between 3 and 5 times as fast as previous president-elects have done. Okay, I joked in the New York Times the other day, I said it's like the Star Wars bar scene of nominees. But I would say either he has the perfect transition team that's the most efficient in history, or he's not doing proper vetting. My gut is it's the latter. If you look at the stories around the appointment of Matt Gaetz, he wasn't on the list of the transition team. He didn't do any vetting, and they were kind of on the plane together, and Trump said, all right, you take the job, and he tweeted it out. So the second thing is that Rich talked about these memoranda of understanding, these agreements between the transition team and the sitting administration, which Rich, I think you personally signed those in 2016 between the Trump transition team and the White House, DOJ, and the GSA. There's 2 which are really important. They're all important. Space and technology are really important. But I would say the more important things would be he doesn't have access to FBI background checks right now, which not only is in the interest of our country, even though they're a total pain to go through. Rich and I have both gone through them. They're horrible processes and very intrusive. And second is he can't formally submit nominations to the Senate for consideration unless those nominees have gone through an FBI background check. So he's naming officials to be in the cabinet, but they can't be submitted to the Senate. And then second is he hasn't signed the agreement which allows him to go collaborate with the outgoing administration. Now, Biden and Trump have polar opposite views on a lot of things. Okay. But there are areas where, as a country, we want the Trump team to have access to the best information. Take Iran, for example. both Biden and Trump see great risk in Iranian behavior in the Middle East, globally, funding terrorism. The Trump team, the American people would benefit from the Trump team having full access to intelligence and other information on the Iranian threat, so that when the Trump team takes office, they're ready to go. They're not learning on the job on January 20th. So I think those are the things that concern me the most. And, you know, Rich, I don't know if you have a reaction to anything I said.
And before you answer, Rich, one argument I've heard is, as you point out, he's done this before. He kind of knows what he wants, and maybe the speed is part of the advantage of having done this before. And he is not interested in essentially the kind of establishment way of doing things. I don't know how powerful these arguments are, but they have been made.
I think it certainly does relate to the fact that the president-elect has been through this before, knows what he wants, and has a view of how he wants to do it. But I offer two observations, sort of at a higher level. First is that, again, a lot of the work is below the waterline, and I do not have insight or like a real view of how that is going. But delay in that work can have serious consequences. I think one of the lessons from 2016 is the delay that followed the sort of replacement of the transition leadership after the election led to, I don't know whether it's a lost month or more, but if you're behind in September, which we weren't, but you're then going to be more behind in November. And if you take a month off in November, you're going to really be feeling it in the first quarter. And if you're not, doing what you should in your first 100 days, it impacts your first year, and your first year affects the whole term. So it sort of snowballs, and therefore, hitting the marks, getting the work done during this transition, during this transition period is very important. A second thought is, even in like an administration that is committed to a dramatic change in direction in policy, there's still best practices for how to be most effective in advancing your policy agenda. And I personally think it's important to sort of separate well-established pathways to being effective on policy and implementing an agenda and getting things done, from the fact that the policies that the president-elect is advocating, could recommend, dramatic changes. So if a transition is not done well, and again, I don't have a whole lot of insight into it, that it ultimately impacts the ability to be effective with those policy objectives.
So the president-elect has been moving fast. Rich, you mentioned that a lot of the work is below the waterline. But we've spent a lot of time kind of not just above the waterline, but kind of in the headlights. People in my business obviously have a lot to do with that. How does the public perception of what the transition is relate to governance down the road? How important is that?
I mean, I think it's typically seen as an opportunity, by the president-elect and the incoming administration to, both try to unify the country after a contentious election, but then also sort of, consolidate a mandate. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not there's a mandate, but when the voters have spoken and the majority is reached, it becomes a mandate of some kind or another. And a transition is sort of a period of time to communicate how that mandate is going to be exercised. And that's why one of the 4 work streams of a transition that Dave outlined before is what he referred to as president-elect support, but it's really, you know, sort of building and operating the government in waiting outside of the government, in terms of, you know, managing, you know, communications, stakeholder engagement, the president-elect's calendar, you know, public appearances, you know, to sort of carry forward that, you know, that communications plan, you know, during this very important period. Recognizing, of course, you know, that we only have one president at a time.
Right.
And, you know, the transition is I make the analogy that, I don't know whether it's a good one, that it's like when you're building a new software platform, you know, or a new website, you build it out completely in a staging area. And then you get to the time when it's going to go live and you flick the switch and you hope it doesn't crash. And I think that part of the analogy may work, but the part of the analogy doesn't work is that you're building the staging area with everybody watching.
Right. So David, you mentioned this, that this was reminded you of the bar scene in Star Wars. What, how much of an anomaly is this current transition in terms of historical precedent?
You know, I think that, as you know, and as Rich knows, President-elect Trump does everything unconventionally. The conventional way to do this is to have a sequence of appointments that reflects the priorities of the incoming administration. So going back to Clinton, he was elected during a recession where the economy was the #1 issue. And so his first appointments was his economic team. And he took, say, 3 to 4 weeks and then rolled out his economic team, which was Lloyd Bentsen and Laura Tyson and Bob Rubin. President George H.W. Bush wanted to emphasize national security. So he rolled out his national security team first, Brent Scowcroft and Colin Powell and James Baker. Traditionally, there's an event and the nominee gets to speak and there's pageantry. And instead, Trump is just doing this by tweet, rapid fire, or maybe Truth Social. And there doesn't seem to be rhyme or reason. You know, he just makes a decision and then announces it. So I would say this is a non-traditional transition. And my gut is that it'll be a non-traditional presidency. You know, I think that one of the things I wrote about in my book, which was informed by interviewing people like Rich and Chris Christie, was there's a high correlation between the quality of a transition and the direction of a transition and the president's first year. Okay. So Governor Christie, with whom Chris worked, I remember interviewing him, and he basically said that the Trump team never recovered from the poor start. And I would say that Clinton, who in my view was a great president, 2-term president, he had a terrible transition, was not ready, did not want to appear presumptuous, and he had a terrible first year. He didn't appoint his chief of staff designate until mid-December. And that should be the first appointment that a president-elect announces. I think by contrast, Reagan and Obama had very good transitions. Reagan had the confidence to appoint James Baker as chief of staff and let him run things, even though Reagan didn't really know him very well. And Baker had run 2 campaigns against Reagan. But he basically said, I want to get the best people and let them run things, and I'll focus on the things that I can do being president, and then we'll have someone that knows how to run the government. So yeah, I think there's a high correlation between the quality of a transition and the start of a presidency. And whether you like the incoming president or not, the American people want the incoming president to be effective to advance our interests.
to have somebody run two campaigns against you is one way to get to know them pretty well, especially.
Yes, exactly.
Rich, I think you were saying the same thing about kind of the correlation between the quality of the transition and the quality of the governance that follows. Do you want to?
Absolutely. And both to be ready for day one, right? Transitions talk about day one, day 100, often day 200. Day one, the president-elect, what are they going to do on the first day? Executive orders, executive action. There's the traditional sort of quote honeymoon period of 100 days, which a lot of like pundits like looks at as a milestone. But I really think of 200 days because that's like really through the July recess of Congress in a president's first year. And being ready on day one is like directly correlated to, are you going to have accomplished by day 200 what you set out to? And that's both being ready and avoiding unforced errors. And, you know, some of that work is the pretty dry but important work of there'll be like, you know, dozens of day one executive orders and executive actions to make sure they're done right, that they're, you know, properly prepared. You know, there's a process by which the Department of Justice has the Office of Legal Counsel, which provides for the executive branch a sort of legal and constitutional review of executive actions. Well, they make a team available, you know, that's sort of walled off, but they make a team available to support an incoming administration to help them get their, you know, sort of day one executive orders and things like that in proper format. And like that's the sort of work that if it's overlooked or not done can result in early stage actions that kind of that misfire and a loss of momentum. So absolutely, you know, I think the quality and thoroughness of a transition translates to a president's first year, not just for appointments and the pace of appointments, but also the success in terms of beginning to run the government and implement a policy agenda.
David, you mentioned the messaging that comes from making deliberate and carefully announced appointments. Do you take any comfort in the fact that maybe what the president-elect is trying to do is signal that he intends to move fast, break things, and that he is surrounding himself with people who will do that? I mean, is there this?
I don't take comfort in that, no. I mean, I think hopefully you've heard from my comments that I'm a Democrat, but I've worked very effectively with people from both sides. And I would say that, you know, in the transition, as a transition geek, you know, the person that would start in the Transition Hall of Fame would be George Bush and Josh Bolten. I think there's a deliberate attempt by the president-elect to disrupt things in Washington, and he's appointing people that are unconventional and disruptive and that are going to challenge institutions. So let's bifurcate between some of the nominees. Okay, so Marco Rubio, who Rich knows well, I'm sure, from various, you know, like if I were president or head of a transition, he wouldn't be my appointee, but I think he's a smart, capable, thoughtful, serious person and highly qualified to be Secretary of State, whether you agree with him or not. Same with the nomination for the UN ambassador. I think that if you look at someone like Matt Gaetz, he is clearly, putting aside his ethics issues, he's not qualified to be Attorney General, in my view. So I think the Senate will be, you know, Senate has an advice and consent role, and Trump is going to put Republican senators in a very tough position to make decisions over some of these nominees. I assume that, you know, Rubio will get a lot of Democratic votes, I assume that the three most controversial nominations, Tulsi Gabbard, Gaetz, and RFK Jr., I assume they'll get very few, if any, Democratic votes. So then the question is, will there be 4 Republican votes against them? Based on what I'm hearing and reading, Gates will not have the votes. And I think there's an open question as to whether more than 4 Republican senators would vote against Gabbard and RFK. Then the question is, will Trump use appointments power to appoint during a recess? And that creates a whole nother set of issues. I guess in my gut, this is what Trump wants. You know, like I love data, and so I looked it up. So Trump had 4 secretaries of DOD, DOJ, HHS, and the DNI during his term. And he had 6 different people run DHS in a 4-year term. So if he does use the temporary appointments power, they can only be, there's limited amount of time that they can stay in office, but that limited amount of time would actually be more than the average tenure of the people that were there in his first term. So yes, I don't take any comfort, but I think that Trump is doing exactly what he wants to do and disrupt.
Rich?
Yeah, I do think that's right. I do think it is strategic in 2 ways. One, in nominating for a series of high-profile posts, folks who represent and will take a dramatically different approach, you know, to leading their departments. And then also, I think perhaps with respect to the timing, you know, that it wasn't accidental, that you know, some of the more controversial picks were announced in rapid succession together after a series of less controversial picks. But I think it's also important to know whether someone agrees with those strategies or disagrees with them. That our Constitution works. And the institutions of our Constitution, with its checks and balances, have not failed us. And part of that is the role of the United States Senate, right? It's one of the founders, right, made the statement. David could probably tell us which one. That the House is like the cup of hot tea, and the Senate is the saucer that captures it and lets it cool. And the institution of the Senate and the responsibility for advice and consent is as long as and drawn out as it can be for the 1,000 positions that require Senate advice and consent, and whether that's too many and what impact that has on an incoming administration is a really important part of our system. And I think we're going to see it up close in the months ahead.
All right, I was going to ask about what you find encouraging, but why don't we answer those in the Q&A. Amy.
Yes, thank you so much, gentlemen. I know that we could keep having this conversation going, and I know so many topics came up, but we've gotten some really good questions that have been coming in from our audience. And so I'm going to start with Carlos. Carlos wants to know, what topics do you think are going to change drastically between these 2 governments, between these 2 administrations, and are going to be the hardest to transition? And any of the 3 that, and Terry, you should feel free to answer too, but maybe, we can start with you, David.
It's hard. I guess it's a really good question, but I guess the question, I would reframe it to say, what's not going to change? I mean, I think that Trump wants to change everything, or much of the direction of government, from immigration to economic policy to ethics to the checks and balances in government. I think one of the things that that we're seeing with these picks is he does not want people around him that are going to question his decisions or create roadblocks. I remember in the first administration, many people that I know and respect worked for him in various departments, including the White House, and they would often say, it's been a good day because I impeded a crazy idea. he does not want people around him that are going to impede him like they did in the last term. So I think everything's going to change. But Rich and Terry, I want to hear from you.
Look, I think that one of the things that in terms of policy that's going to change is obviously the questions and the rhetoric around immigration. And I think what is a little ironic is being able to execute on the changes is going to be very, very difficult because it's a very difficult issue. It's not interminable and intractable and impossible to figure out because it's easy. It's because it's all of those things. And I think we're just going to have a different approach in trying to deal with like a monumental problem, which is, you know, in some ways a metaphor for the entire government. They're really, really hard problems.
I'll just super quickly tick off four for each. I think the question is going to become what are the limits of executive action, versus legislation, and those would be no surprise. Immigration, trade, specifically with tariffs, energy policy, including related to climate, and just like the general deregulatory environment.
Excellent. We've actually gotten a couple of questions. Riva was one. We had another person ask, and it's almost asking all three of you to look maybe in your crystal ball a little too, because it's farther along. But do you think we should anticipate any difference in 2028 transition given the difficulties that the Trump team created in 2020? And that was followed up by, do you think there's a possibility that Trump does not relinquish power in 2028? So if we were going to look that far ahead, could you offer any insights?
We're going to defer to David.
I want to hear Rich.
So, I mean, President Trump will be term limited in 2028, and that will, I think, answer part of your question. What a 2028 transition out by a Trump administration looks like, I think would not only completely unsettled, but I would not look to 2020 as a setting the foundation for that, because that was a very different circumstance, obviously, of him like refusing to concede.
Yeah, I agree with that. And look, the 2020 transition was one of the worst transitions in history. It was a time of various crises. Remember, we had COVID, we had the wake of the George Floyd murder. We had a political crisis, and we were in a recession, and the outgoing president of the United States did not recognize the outcome of the election. He did push the system to the max and to the brink, but as Rich said, our Constitution worked, our institutions bent, but they didn't break, and he left office, and there was a peaceful transition of power. It was bumpy, and it's I think only the second time since Lincoln that an American citizen actually died during the transition on January 6th, several American citizens. But he left office. And so, no, I don't anticipate problems in 2028 in the way that we saw in 2020.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because we've looked at this a lot of the perspective of the people that are hired to do the transition and the advisors. What role do outside groups and outside, whether they're nonprofits or journalism, that's what Katie wants to know. Do outside groups have an influence on what's happening in the next couple months?
Yeah, absolutely. And they should, right? In a democracy and sort of stakeholder activism. So that can include, think tanks, policy organizations, and frankly, I was surprised in 2016 that there was not more, because I thought it would be, and granted, as David mentioned, I left the transition within a few days just after the election, but I would have anticipated a lot more sort of advocates and stakeholders and people trying to like communicate their policy views to the transition. That surely picks up dramatically after the election. I'm sure that's happening now, and I would say is an important part of our democratic process.
Maybe I'd just add to that, Terry, what do you think the role of journalists as outside forces are in this process? What should they be doing during this?
I mean, I think, traditionally we spend a lot of time kind of looking at kind of the policy positions and how those are going to be implemented, who is going to be executing these policy positions, who is using their leverage on the outside to affect decisions. And, we do this in service of the people who make that big decision, deciding who gets to be in the White House, have the information they kind of need to continue to manage their government. It's gotten a lot harder, in part because of the climate, in part because of the tools that we use, in part because of the tools that the electorate has access to in terms of social media. But I think the central work of informing Americans about their government, about themselves, and about their communities is invaluable, and is even more so in a moment like this. And I hope people continue to do that.
Thank you, Terry. I want to get to final thoughts from everybody, but I'd be remiss not to ask Kendra, who had a quick question, and it kind of follows up on what we were talking about with Katie. She wants to know, like, given today's political climate, what would your recommendation be for people who are nonpartisan to assist in the presidential transition? In other words, how can nonpartisan entities be the most helpful in this presidential transition? Which I think is a good question. I don't know.
It's a great question. And maybe this will be my final comment. If you're interested in government, if you're interested in management, if you're interested in policy and politics, the transition is about as interesting and important an area to contribute as anything you can do. It's an intense period that's critical for our government, and the stakes are really, really high. There's one other thing which is really important about transitions, which is it is traditionally a very, very nonpartisan, bipartisan area, that friends and foe who fight like cats and dogs during an election come together to do what's best for the country. So why was it that Dennis McDonough, the outgoing chief of staff for Barack Obama, who clearly wanted Hillary Clinton to win, why was he on the phone all the time with Rich Bagger, who was working for President-elect Trump, or the candidate Trump? It's because both Rich and Dennis, while they have political differences, want to do what's best for the country. And that's why I love this area of work and the topic. And that's why I'm really pleased to be here with Terrence and you, Amy, and Rich.
Thank you. Rich, do you have some final thoughts before we wrap up?
Just I couldn't possibly put it better than that. The experience I had, between May and November, that's earlier you start, May and November 2016 was one of the most fulfilling things I've ever been part of in my professional career. And because it is the spirit of public service, obviously it's in a partisan context, but it is about serving the country and being prepared to govern. And exactly as Dave, I mean, I remember like sitting in the White House Chief of Staff's office with the leader of Secretary Clinton's transition planning team sitting next to me, receiving briefings together. And that just so symbolically shows what it's all about, and then how how an outgoing administration and an incoming administration of different parties, while they may disagree completely about the specific policies, work together to ensure that the national security of the United States is maintained, and that the government is able to have a smooth transition. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you today.
Well, we're so glad that you can join us. I want to thank all three of you. Terry, thank you so much for guiding us through this conversation. It's so much we could talk about. So you were, flawless in helping us kind of hit the main points. So we really appreciate it. David and Rich, I think that you're the best example of a bipartisan conversation, on these topics, and the fact that both of you can come together and bring your experiences. I also want to say we're going to make sure, David, to get out in our newsletter your book and how to access it, because if this piqued your interest today, The Peaceful Transfer of Power, I have read it cover to cover. Thank you. Don't quiz me, but I have read this book, and it's been helpful. And I think the biggest thing that we want to help everybody with here at the Sign Institute and with our partners at the Kogod School of Business and certainly the School of Public Affairs here at American University is, if you understand the process, that you can be a part of this conversation. Public service is a part of all of us. The Civic Life series really wants to make sure that we're informed about these issues as we go forward. We want to thank everybody that joined us today and asked questions, to the people who joined us on live stream. And we did record this, and we are going to make it available to the broader community throughout the coming weeks as you have questions and whatnot. So gentlemen, all three of you, I thank you for your expertise. Most importantly, I thank you for your time. And we promise to keep convening, communicating, and collaborating on these issues and more. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.